Ever get that feeling like when you just realize how huge some moments in history really were?
Yeah.
Like, try to imagine for a second being part of a people scattered, for centuries, and then actually daring to say, we're going to make a nation again.
That's gotta take guts for sure.
No kidding. And the story of how Israel began, it's just full of these crazy, audacious moments.
Oh, absolutely.
And lucky for us, we get to jump into this whole thing through the eyes of the man at the heart of it all, David Ben Gurion.
We're going way past the boring textbook stuff, too.
Oh, good.
Straight to Ben Gurion's own words. From his book, it came out in '54, Rebirth and Destiny of Israel. Like, we get this, I don't know, this peek inside the mind of the guy who basically built modern-day Israel.
Right. Okay, so the book, it starts when Ben Gurion first gets to Palestine, early 1900s. And you can tell right off the bat, this wasn't just some political game he was playing. This was personal, deeply personal.
The way he describes it all, so vivid. The sounds, you can practically hear the jackals howling at night, you know? And that sweet smell of acacia blossoms, that heavy Palestinian sun, he drops you right there, man.
He makes you feel it. Like, this wasn't some abstract homeland idea. It was real.
Oh, yeah.
Dirt under your fingernails real.
Exactly. And, you know, that ties right into one of his most fundamental beliefs, ownership through labor.
Okay, what does that mean, though?
So Ben Gurion, he's saying treaties, international agreements, all that. Yeah, that's one thing. But true ownership.
Yeah.
That only comes from the work, the sweat you put into the land.
Interesting. So less about this is mine because history, more about this is mine because of what I'm doing here right now.
Exactly. And that idea, that was everything to those early Zionist pioneers. They weren't just dreaming of a homeland, they were building it.
With their own two hands.
Yes. Brick by brick, field by field.
Which I guess is where this whole idea of the power of labor comes in, right? It wasn't just about getting a job. It was about, creating a whole society.
Exactly. Ben Gurion talks about how, for these pioneers, most of them young, idealistic, getting work was their top priority.
Makes sense.
But here's where it gets interesting. They actually faced resistance. And not just from the outside, but from their own community.
Wait, really? I thought everyone showing up in Palestine back then was all on the same side. Who was resisting them?
You'd think, right.
Yeah.
But get this. Ben Gurion describes how some of the Jewish farmers, the ones who were already there, they were used to having cheaper Arab labor. They weren't so keen on hiring these new Jewish workers.
I don't get it. You'd think they'd be happy, supporting their own people. What was the thought process there?
It just goes to show how complicated the whole situation was. Some were afraid they'd lose money if they had to pay higher wages. Others, worried about their culture changing. It wasn't as simple as everyone being on the exact same page, even with this shared goal of a Jewish homeland.
Wow. So how'd the pioneers get around that? How'd they get those jobs they desperately needed?
Ben Gurion tells this great story about these young guys, just came from studying religious texts, the yeshivas, right?
Yeah.
And they specifically go after the jobs nobody else wants. Night watchman.
Clever. Get a foot in the door, even if it's the back door, and prove yourself.
Exactly. And they did just that. Worked hard, showed their dedication, and slowly the balance started to shift. Ben Gurion talks about how they eventually got jobs protecting vineyards, guarding flocks, things people thought were too dangerous for them before.
So they're literally building a nation, but they're also proving themselves every step of the way. It wasn't all easy, though, was it?
Yeah.
Because Ben Gurion doesn't sugarcoat the tough stuff either.
Oh, not at all. He talks about the very real threat of violence always hanging over them, having to constantly deal with the British presence in Palestine, and even arguments within the Zionist movement itself. There were huge debates about whether they should only rely on Jewish labor or cooperate with Arab workers.
Okay, hold on. There's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with the violence. You said Ben Gurion doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
What's an example?
He describes this, this constant fear, the uncertainty, like the very real threat of violence that just hung over everything back then.
Yeah, right.
He talks about this young carpenter, Shimon Melamed, came to Palestine full of hope, wanted to farm the land, and he was killed in an Arab attack.
It's just heartbreaking. It really shows you what these pioneers were up against and how committed they were to this dream.
And that's where Ben Gurion's leadership, it really comes through, He talks about navigating all that tension, the violence, the politics, even the disagreements within the movement.
So he's not just this, ideological figurehead. He's down in the thick of it, making tough calls.
Exactly. And he even criticizes those who, put all their faith in diplomacy.
Really?
Oh, yeah, he's all about self-reliance, taking action, making things happen.
A man of action. Which I guess makes sense given the vision he lays out for the future of Israel, because this wasn't just about grabbing some land, it was about building a whole new society.
Exactly. He wanted a thriving Jewish state, a beacon of, like, science and culture, a place where the Jewish spirit could be, renewed. He was adamant that Jewish leadership was crucial, especially in education.
Interesting.
He believed they needed to build their own institutions, shape their own destiny, not rely on the British.
There's that self-reliance again. But I'm guessing not everyone agreed with his vision. What about the idea of a binational state? One shared equally by Jews and Arabs. That was a huge debate back then.
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge point of contention. And Ben Gurion, he tackles it head on. He makes a very strong case against a binational state, talks about the problems with shared governance, the different national aspirations.
So he's trying to create a future for his people, but at the same time, he's navigating this incredibly complex political landscape with all these different groups vying for power.
Yeah, and you see him wrestling with that tension between idealism and pragmatism.
Okay.
Like, he talks about how important immigration is for a thriving Jewish state.
Right.
But also, he's realistic about how many people Palestine can actually handle.
So he's not just some hardliner. He's thinking practically
Right.
about the economics, the long-term sustainability of it all.
Totally. He stresses the need for a strong Jewish working class, for developing agriculture, for moving beyond just agriculture. He's thinking about building a society, not just a state.
And I'm guessing the elephant in the room, so to speak, was the Arab question. How does he even begin to approach something so incredibly complex?
Well, you got to remember, he's writing this in 1954.
Right.
After Israel is established, after the war in 48.
Right. So he's looking back on it all.
Exactly. He acknowledges how complex it all is, but ultimately he felt a Jewish state was the only real solution, given everything that happened.
Makes sense. And he's pretty open about his feelings on the British, too, isn't he?
To put it mildly, Ben Gurion does not hold back when it comes to British policy. He accuses them of hypocrisy, of breaking promises, especially with the restrictions they put on Jewish immigration during the Holocaust. When so many lives were at stake.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for him, to be so close to this dream and then be met with those roadblocks.
Oh, it was a constant source of tension. He talks about how divided the Zionist movement was on how to respond to the British. Some wanted diplomacy, cooperation, but others, like Ben Gurion, argued for a much more, assertive, maybe even defiant approach.
Wow. So you have all these different personalities, ideologies, even within the movement itself.
Yeah.
Yet they still managed to achieve independence in 48. But I'm guessing that wasn't the end of the story, was it?
Oh, not at all. Ben Gurion knew that declaring independence, that was just the first step. The real challenge, the bigger challenge, was building a nation from scratch.
So what were some of those challenges? What did that look like in practice, trying to build a nation from the ground up?
Ben Gurion faced a mountain of obstacles, Imagine having to build an army almost overnight, while also dealing with this huge wave of immigration from all over the world.
Oh, wow.
People from different backgrounds, speaking different languages, with different customs, and then on top of all that, trying to create a national identity from this collection of exiles.
Wow. That sounds incredibly daunting. How do you even start to create a sense of unity from such a diverse group of people?
Ben Gurion recognized that this wasn't just a logistical challenge, but a cultural and spiritual one too, right? He knew they needed a shared language, a shared history, a shared purpose.
Yeah, I see.
He wanted to create a melting pot, but not one that erased individual identities, more like, a tapestry, where each thread adds to the strength and the beauty of the whole.
That's a beautiful way to put it. But he was also realistic about the potential for division, wasn't he?
No, absolutely. He talks about how crucial it is to have a strong, unified government.
Yeah.
One that can make tough decisions, uphold the rule of law. He knew that without that solid foundation, the whole dream of a Jewish state could easily fall apart.
So, again, not just a dreamer, but a pragmatist, a builder, someone who understood what it takes to actually create a functioning state.
Exactly. He talks about the importance of building a strong economy, developing industry, investing in science and technology. He even saw potential in the Negev desert, which back then people thought was just useless wasteland.
And now look at it. The Negev is like this hub for innovation, for agriculture. It's pretty amazing. when you think about it.
It really is. He was a visionary in a lot of ways, but he still had to deal with internal conflicts, too.
Oh, I bet.
He talks about the challenges of dealing with dissenting voices, extremist groups that rejected the authority of the state.
So even after independence, the fight wasn't over.
Right.
There were still battles to be fought, ideological differences to bridge.
Exactly. And Ben Gurion, he faced those challenges head on. He believed in strong leadership, in upholding the rule of law, in making difficult choices for the greater good. He was always trying to balance these competing priorities, security versus freedom, idealism versus pragmatism, unity versus diversity.
It sounds like he carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders.
Yeah.
Always trying to find that balance, but no nation exists in a vacuum, right? So how did he see Israel's place on the world stage?
It's interesting, isn't it? Like, he wasn't just looking at Israel as, another country on the map.
Right.
It was this, spiritual center for Jewish people everywhere.
Yeah, this idea of, a global homeland, almost.
Exactly. He talks about the ingathering of exiles, and it wasn't just about physically coming back to the land. It was this deeper, cultural and spiritual transformation. He really thought Israel could be this place where Jewish culture, Jewish identity, all of it could be renewed.
So even after they had a country, that connection to the diaspora, it was still super important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he thought that connection could actually help Israel standing in the world, too.
How so?
By becoming this hub of Jewish culture and learning, that could attract support, goodwill from Jewish people all over.
Smart, strategically speaking. But wasn't Ben Gurion also a realist? He couldn't have been naive about the dangers, especially for a new nation like Israel.
Oh, he wasn't naive at all. He knew the world was a dangerous place. He was really serious about the need for a strong military, about being able to defend themselves. He'd seen firsthand what happens when you depend on others for protection.
Right. And that probably played into his whole stance on alliances, especially the relationship with the United States.
Totally. He saw that relationship as, make or break for Israel's safety in the long run. Push really hard for strong ties with the U.S., which, looking back from now, is really interesting how much emphasis he put on it back then in the 50s.
Yeah. So he was thinking long-term about global politics, all that. But he never forgot about the human side of things either. Because in the end, countries are built by people, not just armies and treaties.
That's one of the most powerful things about his writing. He always brings it back to the people. For him, the ingathering of exiles, it wasn't just about numbers. It was a chance to build a whole new kind of Jewish society.
Okay.
One based on justice, equality, social responsibility.
So he wasn't just building a country. He was building, a whole new way of life, almost, based on these values he really believed in.
Exactly. A strong education system, a thriving arts and culture scene. He wanted a society that valued knowledge, innovation. He saw education as the key to unlocking Israel's potential, really. He even thought Israel could be a global leader in science and technology someday.
Wow. Ben Gurion really sounds like he was a visionary. Someone who understood that ideas can shape the future. And it makes you think about Israel as this work in progress, even now.
Totally. He leaves you with this question, what does it actually mean to build a nation? Not just a state, but a nation in a place so loaded with history and identity. And that question, it still matters today.
It really does. Makes you think about what it even means to be Israeli, to be part of this whole story of rebirth and renewal.
And that's what's so amazing about really digging into Ben Gurion's words. Nation building isn't some finish line you cross. It's a process, always changing, evolving.
Right.
And he makes us think about what role do we have in all of this and shaping the world now and in the future.
It's pretty powerful stuff. From these scattered groups of people just longing for a home to this whole nation, making its mark on the world. It took guts, it took resilience, just incredible determination, and it's still going on.
And on that note, I think this is the perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into David Ben Gurion's Rebirth and Destiny of Israel.
Definitely. It's been a fascinating journey through the mind of one of the most influential figures of the 20th century.
A man who not only witnessed history, but shaped it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And his story reminds us that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It's alive, it's ongoing, and we all have a part to play in writing its next chapter.